All right, Sam. Uh, I know we've done this before. I love your stuff. So, like, still, can you introduce yourself for the audience?
Yeah, my name's Sam. I'm a physio out of Sydney, Australia. I currently work at a clinic called Proform Physiotherapy. And yeah, I've been a physio for 3 years now, but my main interest is movement analysis and some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about today. And I think, as I mentioned in your last podcast, it was the stuff that I came across with Franz Bosch and even people like Rob Gray, Dan Pfaff, all those sorts of people. And that really inspired how I go about analyzing my patients and my athletes that I see and how I overcome their injuries. And so far, I've seen absolutely excellent results and stuff that I didn't think was possible with rehab. So the more I go along with this sort of stuff, the more I believe that it's actually the way forward, especially bridging the gap between once someone's sort of gotten over that acute period of the injury to actually going back on the field and what that looks like for them.
Nice, nice, nice. So that's also the case for me. Although I didn't really like go to his education, I know you did his course, right? Although I didn't really
Yeah,
do
I
his
did.
education, but like I do like implement his stuff and really think that's helpful. So, um, just for a reminder for those who like listen to the first podcast we did, like what are the common scene like attractors?
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll touch on each of those as we go about this video analysis for the different sports. But I certainly think you've got your things like swing leg retraction, hip lock, foot plant from above, extended force closure, upper body first, those sorts of things. It's quite a long list. If you really want to know specifically all about them, maybe go back to the previous podcast and that will give you a detailed breakdown of all of my definitions and things like that. But as we go along with this analysis, I will break down again what those things are and why they're important, and also why I'm looking out for them and how I'm trying to analyze people and seeing whether they're doing these things really well. And it's quite interesting when you look at an NBA player or an elite footballer and try and use some of these analyses and realize that they're actually not always doing all of the things that they should be doing. So there's always room for improvement, even for the top guys and girls.
Nice, nice. So, uh, how about we start from basketball players?
Yeah, I'll
Yeah,
screen. Hopefully, there's no technical difficulties here.
yeah, I might need you to share the screen.
Yeah, that's okay. Okay, perfect. So we'll keep repeating this as we go along so that you guys can watch it multiple times. But let's have a look at the first component that I would say that he's doing extremely well. And that's he gets into a 4 bar system in the deceleration. So you'll notice that as he approaches the defender, obviously it's much harder for the defender in this particular position because they've got their back turned to where they need to be. He's kind of scrambling to get into a certain position. And you can even notice that as he slips into that foot plant from above, which is basically as your foot strikes the ground, we need that to be in the direction of the ground reaction force. So if you look at the player in white and you watch what happens as he takes that final step to try and slow down, his foot slips on the floor. So that means that he hasn't done foot plant from above really well. And the preceding movements that happen for him, he's got no chance of being able to get onto this attacker who's doing certain things really, really well. So if we have a look at the attacker first, as I mentioned, he gets into what's called a 4 bar system position really well. So 4 bar system is when we have muscles like our rectus femoris or one of our 4 quad muscles and our hamstrings functioning well together like this sort of pattern. So you can think like each side of the thigh, they work in parallel to transfer knee energy from the knee to the hip and hip to the knee. And then from there, we get what's called a co-contraction. So in our co-contractions, if the quad muscles are contracting equally and at the same time as the hamstrings, we then get a good deceleration pattern around the knee and the hip. So he does that very well on both of his legs. Then as we move across to when he actually tries to change direction to go past the defender, one thing that I remember even in football, which we'll talk about in a little bit, one of the defenders who plays for Liverpool actually talked about is when he's trying to look at an opponent when he's defending them and judge which way that they're going to go, he'll often look at their eyes first of all, but he'll also be looking at their hip position too. So can he read what's happening at the hip to try and judge which direction that they're going? If you achieve upper body first as your primary change of direction technique, it's going to be much harder for that defender to try and get into a position to judge which way you're going. And you'll notice that this attacker here does that extremely well. As he decelerates, plants his feet, and then goes to change direction to the right, he leads that turn with his upper body. In other words, you can sort of see that his right shoulder, as he's turning, leads the turn. And then once he's past that defender, it's pretty much game over after that. Some other stuff that I would say that he does really well is another thing called true rotation. So with true rotation, basically your shoulders and eventually your hips are turning in the same direction. Anti-rotation is obviously the opposite, which we might talk about a little bit later in our football example. But you'll notice for him that because he does all of the other things really well, because he decelerates, because he turns with his upper body first, his true rotation pattern is really good. And as he goes to walk past or run past that defender, he then is able to get into that hip lock pattern to push off really well and get past him. So in summary, some key things that you would be looking at as you're approaching a defender is, are you getting into a four bar system pattern really well, which is in other words, flexed hip and flexed knee and an upright posture. So he does all of those things really well. Is he changing direction with his upper body first? So if we're turning to the right, are we leading the turn with our right shoulder and vice versa with the left? And finally, are we seeing good ankle stiffness to be able to push off into the change of direction? And if you achieve all of those things, it's going to be much harder for a defender to actually get into good positions to defend you, first of all, and also your athlete.
Nice, nice. So, let's go to the next one. So it should be like here. Yeah. This is a classic one.
This is a classic one. Yeah. And I think it's really important to distinguish here, looking at trunk position, the differences between certain players. And in particular, in basketball, you'll notice that some players have a really extended trunk or torso, and some have quite a flexed trunk or torso. Now, I think some questions that I'll often get is, well, just because this player isn't doing all of these things strictly, does that mean that they're going to be a bad player? Or when we're looking at the good players who aren't doing this really well, well, they can still beat their defender. So what does it matter? And I think it's important to note here that as long as we're trying to tick off some of the key attractors, you're probably still going to be able to, in line with obviously your knowledge of the game, have some good efficient movement. The only thing that you might see is that they'll be a bit more predisposed to certain injuries depending on what they're lacking. But for this example, we can see that he has a nice extended trunk. So what that means is if he has an extended trunk, then anything that happens at his hip is much better and well controlled. And the energy transfer from the lumbar spine into the pelvis is much more efficient. because he's co-contracted around the trunk. So that's thing number one for him. Number two is, again, you'll hear me talk about this a lot. He gets into a nice upper body first position as he goes for the crossover right here. So it's helpful, I guess, that he's dribbling in his hands as opposed to football. But you'll notice that as he changes direction in this next couple of little bits, that his right shoulder, as he foot plants, starts to lead the turn. And so you'll notice that as he does that, his push off from that left leg is really efficient. I know we talk a lot about, and you might have heard any of the posh people talking about ankle stiffness. And it's important to note that he also talks about getting out from a dorsiflexed position. So sometimes in sport, you're inevitably going to get into a dorsiflex position, and true ankle stiffness is not going to be achieved. If we're talking about a hip lock pattern, which he doesn't really get into here as he pushes off that left leg, that doesn't happen as well when we don't have plantar flexion or ankle stiffness. So if he's trying to change direction, he's probably going to have to work a bit more concentrically and eccentrically through the knee and the hip, but it's slow enough that he's actually able to do that efficiently and not have to worry. There's not much of a time pressure for him as he strikes the ground. The next thing you can see that his extended force closure here is quite good. So as he plants that left leg, what we're trying to look at is you can see there that his right knee, after he has planted his left leg, travels forwards. So we're seeing that sort of extended force closure around the pelvis occurring, which means that he can then efficiently take that next step first of all, but it's also very protective for the hip and the knee because we're not in these compromised positions. And that's probably the main stuff for him. Obviously, he has just crossed over a bit of a legend, but he's done that really well because he's achieved all of these things efficiently. If I was to look at maybe some stuff that he could have done better, it would be definitely be his swing leg retraction. So a reminder on swing leg retraction, the easiest way to think about this particular retractor is that it's like a whip from the hip. So as you cast your leg forward, your knee and your foot, you then aggressively retract it down into a hip extension moment. And as you do that, you pre-tension all the muscles around the hip, knee, and ankle, and it's much better for you to be able to absorb the ground reaction forces as you do that. Now, in things like sprinting, which we might have talked about last week from memory, it's much more important because the ground reaction forces are much more significant, and it's extremely important for the preceding patterns that occur as you're sprinting. But here, as we're moving through a change of direction and with use of a sport as well, it's obviously going to be a little bit more complex and not quite as pretty. But for him, I do think that he could have done that whip from the hip better, which may have actually allowed him to push off that left leg even more efficiently and quicker. So you can still see that as he's trying to change direction past Jordan, that Jordan's still not too far off the pace for him. He's just evaded him, but he almost gets his hand back across. And if he achieved that swing leg retraction better, he might have actually changed direction quicker than he did in this video.
Nice, nice. Cool. So go to the next one here.
I have to go back a little bit, but this one is an interesting one. So again, as I mentioned, when we're thinking about elite sport, it's obviously something you would question when you're analyzing these people. Well, they're beating their defender, they're scoring points, they're doing this sort of stuff in most people's eyes efficiently. So what's the issue with it? And I guess it's important to hear that it still doesn't mean that they're achieving the absolute optimal movement patterns and that they're still potentially at risk of some injuries. And we know that injuries do happen in sport. But if we pause just as he strikes the ground to change direction so that everybody can see, you'll notice that he gets into a flexed hip extended knee position. And what Bosch talks about is that this is actually a very vulnerable position for people, especially with at-risk ACL injuries. So what we want to see when we're decelerating is either extended hip, extended knee, or flexed hip and flexed knee. If we have the opposite combinations of those things, we do have that potential risk of not being able to deal with the ground reaction force as we slow down. Now, for basketball, sometimes it's not always possible, but you can see here where Eric has paused it, that he has a very flexed hip and a quite extended knee. And so I think what saves him here the most is the position of his torso being in a bit more of an internally rotated position, which then causes his hip to be in an internally rotated position. And what happens when we do that is that our glute max actually co-contracts, oh, sorry, pre-tensions really well. And so it's probably protecting some of the forces that are going through his knee and allowing him to still stay stable. If he was to have been a bit more front on in the sagittal plane and be in this position, that's a very high risk for an ACL injury to occur. Another thing that probably saves him is his foot plant. So you'll notice that as he strikes the ground in this position, as we are going through the video, that his foot doesn't really slip too much. So obviously on a basketball court, it can be slippery depending on what happens when you change direction. But for him, it doesn't really move too much, which is an excellent example of that foot plant from above that we're talking about. So you can see there, ground, his foot is planting the floor in line with the ground reaction force. And we're talking about it probably at a bit more of a diagonal, as you can see here. And so his foot doesn't, what we call, slip in as he strikes the ground. Again, another thing that probably gives him enough pre-tensioning in the muscles to protect his knee as he changes direction.
Well, so
Uh,
one thing I noticed that this one, like on this example, that is probably pretty obvious, different with the previous two, is that this one didn't really hit what so-called like four bar system, that position, am I right?
Definitely. Yeah. So you're not always going to achieve a pure example, I guess, of a four bar system. And that would be an example of somebody who's decelerating with an extended hip, extended knee. That's not always possible, though, as we know. When you're trying to slow down from really, really high speeds, you can't always adopt that posture and immediately change direction to go in the other way. So sometimes what you'll have to do is that step way of slowing down that you'll see people do. But when they're doing that, they've still got a flexed hip and a flexed knee, and therefore a four bar system as they strike the ground. And so for him, you're right, he's not getting into that four bar system. So he's in sort of a hybrid between the two. And it's only those other things that I talked about that really save him from a potential risky moment for his ACL.
Nice, nice. So let's go to this one. Also a classic one.
Yes, you've included a few classics. Yeah, so this is a really good example, I think, of adopting some of these key patterns of movement that you would need to see in basketball when you're down low. So you'll have lots of different moments in a game where you're going to need to be up higher. Obviously, when they're dribbling in these sorts of moments, you'll notice that the defender and the attacker are right down low towards the floor, which means that swing leg retraction is not possible. You can't swing leg retract from a really low position because you can't achieve a whip from the hip. You can maybe achieve a small portion of it, but when you're in this position, it's not possible. So what we need to see here the most is that extended force closure. And you'll see this from this particular athlete as he strikes the ground with that right leg to stop and try and change direction to the other way and fake the defender out. He tries to bring his left knee forward. So we can see it a little bit better here. And it might not go all the way, but as long as we're seeing that moment happening, you'll see that there. It's not all the way through, but if you really pay close attention to what's happening at the hip, he actually does have that extended force closure happening at the hip. He can achieve a bit of foot plant from above from this position, which he does really well, I think. And as he does this, you'll notice that his foot doesn't move on the floor. It stays stuck, and he's actually able to be in that nice deceleration position and therefore in a four bar system. So flexed hip, flexed knee. He's very, very low towards the floor. Probably a drawback for him is that he does have a flexed trunk. So we are compromising that extended force closure a little bit. But the thing that allows him to get past the defender is that upper body first attractor. So he will bring the ball through his legs and turn with his left shoulder, as you can see there. And by that point, it's way too late for the defender to do anything about it. So that's a good reminder again, just because we're seeing good outcomes happening, and we do definitely prefer knowledge of results over knowledge of performance. We can always be better, and we can always look at these elite examples and try and tinker with certain parts of their movement. And if we're thinking about the rehab examples or prehab in this case, because I'm sure here he wasn't injured, judging by how efficiently he's able to beat the defender. Um, we can try and give them some tasks to do that don't make them overanalyze what they're doing and lose all of the good things that they've got already, but it can start to improve some of these patterns of movement in the context of their sport and give them an idea about, well, okay, what's more of an efficient pattern that I can do to beat my defender more times or even quicker than I did before.
Cool. So we we discuss about like these uh most of this is called offender. I want to talk about this one. It's actually pretty simple. The defender, like, let's see. So we talk a lot about like upper body first, but if you look at the defender here, it's actually pretty obvious. He can't reach that, so he, like get so here he can't turn his upper body back in time. So Allen Iverson just make the shot.
Yeah. And if you go back a little bit as well, you'll notice that when he goes from being a little bit more towards the right here, so if we start to look at it again, you look at how compromised that left leg position is, and then delayed reaction there. And as he's pushing off, he does not achieve a good swing leg retraction to try and slow down and go back towards the way that the offender or the attacker is going. And so he's always scrambling in those moments. When we don't respect the sagittal plane and when we don't keep our hips in a good position, sometimes you are going to have a lateral hip lock position, and that's still efficient. But for him, you can see that his trunk was flexed. He poorly swing leg retracts there. As he goes to push off that left leg to try and get back up for the block, he's having to work extremely concentrated and the hip and the knee to try and jump back out of that deepened position. So he's got no chance essentially once that point occurs. He would need to be relying a lot on his tendons to be able to do that. And in that scenario, he's not able to achieve that because he's working concentrically, and we don't have that isometric condition around the muscles of the calf to be able to do that.
This is this is kind of interesting because uh I know, correct me if I'm wrong, but like I know in the running book, France kind of say that in high speed running, it's actually like mus your hamstring is actually like isometric contraction. So it's the tendon that's doing the like elongate and then shortening, right? So so if we put it in here, is it like just what you said? If he can do a better, the defender can do a better job at like doing swing leg retraction. So that means that produce like pre-tension on the force. So that's like, so he's when he gonna jump to block the shot, that's not just concentric, right? He already produced pre-tension, so it's actually like isometric contraction. So it's tendon elongate. Am I correct?
Yeah, I think probably an important thing to note there is what's going to be quicker in that scenario, a tendon elastic reflex or a concentric muscle contraction. And I think you'll find that when there's that much force going through a leg, and you're trying to push off from a weaker position, you're going to find that the tendon recoil is going to be much more efficient. And the reason why you talk about an isometric condition, I think we can even simplify it even further for people into just simply taking up the muscle slack. So if we've taken up the muscle slack really well in the muscle, it allows that tendon to act like an elastic band. If we haven't done that, then we're probably relying a lot more on our muscles to eccentrically and concentrically contract. And therefore, if we're in a scenario where it's very much time constrained and we have to move very, very quickly, you're going to find that somebody who is using their tendons a lot more is going to be able to beat you hands down every single time. If we have a scenario, and he used this in the course, where you've got like a speed skater, for example, they're not worried about their tendons. They're constantly concentrically and eccentrically contracting, and that's because there's no real time constraints for them as they're applying force into the ice. But for somebody who's planting their foot and trying to push off, if you haven't done any of those things, then you've got no chance.
Cool, cool. So let's look at this one, also basketball. Sorry. So here, let's see.
Kyrie gets a lot of compliments for how he moves. Yeah, so with the upper body first attractor, I think it's very important to note that a lot of these scenarios are dependent, especially in basketball. I think it's even more relevant. Depends where the defender is, and every scenario that you're going to be in on the court is going to be slightly different. So it's never going to look exactly the same every single time, as long as I'm seeing some sort of movement in those attractors. That's the most important thing. So for him here, as he goes across his defender, I can definitely see that as he crosses to the right and then comes back onto the left, that he leads that turn with his left as much as he possibly can, which is excellent. And you'll notice what happens with his right leg as he strikes the ground here is that he has a little bit of that whip from the hip moment and foot plant from above. So because he does those things well, he has a nice stable hip that he's able to push off as he tries to turn to the left. And another thing he does really well, I think, is you'll look at his trunk position as he's turning. That is an excellent turn off the left. And then as he turns to the right, off the right, sorry, to the left, he is in a nice extended position and he's got good trunk co-contractions happening. And so when we're thinking about what's going to happen if a defender bumps into him, well, he's given himself the best chance of being able to not only change direction and deal with the ground reaction forces, but also any forces that might be applied to him externally from the defender. Could be a push or, some sort of a bump to put him off balance. And as he gets up into that position, he's in a perfect position to be able to keep his eyes on the basket and get the ball into the net.
Nice, nice, nice. I don't know why, like, uh, when I was looking at these like videos, it's probably just basketball. It's so obvious that they do like swing leg retraction. Oh, upper body first, swing leg retraction, right? It's I don't know why it's is it because of basketball, the nature of the sport?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think if you're differentiating between basketball and football, for example, where the ball's at your feet, it's going to be a lot, not impossible, as we'll see here in this video example, but a lot harder for you to try and lead things with your upper body. But when we go to this example and we look at what this guy does really well, he actually still does what the basketballers are doing well and leads all of the turns with his upper body. Now, it does look a little bit different in terms of the hip lock patterns that he's getting into because he's got the ball at his feet. But you'll notice that each time he tries to change direction, he's leading it with a shot. He doesn't have too much of a flex trunk. And therefore, the hip lock that occurs as he strikes the ground is much more efficient than if he wasn't doing those things. So you'll see here as he tries to cut and push off that left leg, he's in a nice, more extended position to be able to do that. And he's obviously just sent the defender to the shops there. But yeah, that I do agree. It is definitely sport constrained. I don't believe that we have to ignore these things just because there's a difference between a ball in their hand or a ball at their feet. I really do believe that we need to still be training people to do these attractors, and it might mean that in their rehab, it's not always with a ball at their feet. They might be doing stuff with their hands and learning how to be more upright and changing direction, similar to what they do in basketball. And we know how important variability in training is, but I certainly do think that if we can do these a lot more for football athletes, we might find that some of the common injuries in the groin, especially that are occurring, reduce significantly. And that's something that I am super passionate about in Australian football moving forward as I begin to work with more people in the sub elite category, and then hopefully one day a bit more in the elite category. Uh, I'm going to be trying to instill a lot of these things in people because we're seeing injuries that I believe don't need to occur. And certainly for me, when I was playing in a bit of a higher level, and the injuries that I sustained, and I look back on some of the pictures of me and the patterns that I was in, it's certainly something that's avoidable.
Nice, nice. Let's keep, let's put this one. How about this one?
Yeah. So again, upper body first as he goes past that defender. But one thing that I think that Ronaldo and certainly Mbappe as well did and do really well is that they'll keep their head really, really still as they're changing direction. And they're very, very stiff players, I would say, in terms of when we're looking at a sprinter, for example, and how much stiffness that they have in their ankle and their hip. I think that Ronaldo and Mbappe are the same. They have the same sort of characteristics. I'm a Messi fan, I'll say for the record. I do think that he's certainly the best we've seen, but he's very, very different again, and that's the reason why when we're analyzing, we need to make sure that we're looking at the athlete in front of us, because there are body differences as well. But for Ronaldo in that particular example, because he's able to keep his head still, be elongated, and achieve upper body first, his change of direction is going to be efficient.
Nice, nice, nice. So let's go. Probably this one be the last one.
Yeah, so for him, you can kind of see how hard it is to purely achieve some of these things in football, and we can see sort of all the different step overs and movements that are occurring. But when he strikes the ground, you'll notice that he's not fully in that four bar system that we'd be after, but the forces that are going through his left leg. So as we come into this position, he did start off with a slightly extended knee, but he then eventually went into a four bar system. So nothing's ever going to be perfect for these guys, but the closest we can get to it, the better off we'll be.
Nice, nice, nice. So, uh, so we talk about like in basketball or like football, what we mentioned, we talk a lot. there's a lot like upper body first, keep the head still, four bar system, the position of four bar system, a swing leg retraction, and even like hip lock. So, and we also see that when like, let's say some players can't like do the, let's say upper body first, they get blow by, which is like, I think it's really cool that, uh, just like these like rules or these like, principles, you can just easy how easy it is to analyze the movement, right?
Definitely. I mean, this is, I guess a stage one, two, or three analysis, if you will. As the more you understand it, uh, the closer you can get to some of Bosch's analysis and even Turn as well. They're much more in depth. They're it's incredible actually how the eye that they have for movement, and that's something that I definitely aspire to do. But you can definitely get a lot of information that you can act upon with these particular analyses. So people listening who maybe aren't as familiar with this sort of stuff might be thinking, well, how do I implement these things, or what some considerations when I'm just doing purely the old school S&C sort of stuff. And my advice to people is that that stuff has its place and is important in terms of, the general preparatory phase and quality of the body. But if you're not doing this stuff, I don't think that one, you're getting the most out of the athlete, and two, you're doing the most that you can for them to prepare them for the field, whether that be from a return from injury or purely from a performance point of view. I think that this stuff is of the utmost importance. And for anybody, I guess, who hasn't done the Bosch course, I would recommend it absolutely. I know they do it around the world, but it gives you some good insights into how you can implement some of this stuff. And there's always bandwidths to these things. You can take it and run with it. And I think I remember hearing Bosch say that he doesn't claim to for this to be the final solution, of things. But if we can get more people doing this sort of stuff, I think it's going to change sport for the better.
Nice, nice. So before I let you go, I do want to like talk, talk a little bit about like, I'm not a biomechanist. So actually, I never understand the concept of biomechanics. So all those numbers, all those equation, I never understand that. But um, if you if we talk about like, I don't know if I shared this before with you before, but if we talk about like upper body first, isn't that kind of like, what's it called? Post oblique, like post oblique sling, like upper body first, doing the uh agility change of direction. Isn't that the,
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
yeah, you definitely use the slings, obviously, in the body. Hence why the myofascial sling principle kind of does feed into this a little bit. On your point about biomechanics, though, I think this is the beauty of this stuff in that, yes, it is a lot more subjective, but you ask any of the really top coaches in the world from some of the podcasts that I've heard them talk on, and they'll all talk about, well, your eye for movement is your greatest tool. And yes, the numbers are important, but really, I think that if you're not going down that really strict biomechanics realm, and all you want to do is make athletes better, and you don't really you take some objective measures, but you don't really care so much about having, the amount of counter movement jump newtons improving by 5 in a week. If you don't really care about that sort of stuff, I think if you can improve your ability, and this goes for anybody, if you can improve your ability to analyze people, know what good movement looks like, and try and implement some of this stuff into your rehab or prehab principles, it's going to go a long way to making sure that you don't ever need to worry about any of those numbers if you don't want to, especially if we're not working in the upper echelon of elite sport. You know, if we're
Yeah.
working with our sub-elite category, in reality, you can probably get a hell of a lot out of them with just this stuff.
Yeah. And oh, I kind of forgot what is the tractor name for deceleration? Is it uh force closure, right? Am I right?
Yeah, so extended force closure
Yeah.
would be when you've got one of your legs in the air. If you've got both of them that are striking the ground, you'd want to be in that nice hip hinge, four bar system position.
So isn't that kind of like let's say, correct me if I'm wrong, but like isn't that just how like deceleration works, like internal rotation on one side of the hip, like tibia internal rotation, like like if you look at sprinting, isn't that how you like decrease the f impact force?
Hopefully, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, when we look at field sport, that doesn't always happen, you know, especially for soccer in particular, when you have to adapt to your environment and it's not just running 100 meters in a straight line and trying to slow down at the end, hopefully after you've run a world record, you know, it's not always going to happen. So you need to create that awareness for the athletes if they don't have it.
Nice, nice, nice. Cool. So I really enjoy this. So for those who are interested in what we are talking about today, I know you guys implement a lot of like uh the France boss system and into your like training or your rehabbing. So for those who are interested in what we're talking about today, where can they reach out to you?
Yeah, so probably the easiest would be Instagram. My handle is Sam underscore on the move. And I think you'll find this year that I'll be posting a lot more about this stuff, even some analysis stuff as well. So if anybody really is interested, apart from obviously following your people like Franz Bosch, definitely give me a follow and I'll be posting a lot this year about some more of this stuff and even from a rehab point of view, some exercises that you could give your athletes or your patients to try and improve this. But yeah, that would be the best place.
Yeah, nice.